What's an old rancher gonna do? Dig a moat? HOA President Cordelia Blackwood sneered exactly that while demolishing my great-grandfather's 1924 bridge without warning. 24 hours later, she wasn't laughing. Picture the woman who called my family's century-old stonework a rustic eyesore, now knee-deep in muddy creek water. Designer heels sunk in muck, perfect blowout ruined, watching her Tesla disappear under 12 feet of floodwater. "You hillbilly psychopath," she screamed across the water. "How dare you flood my home?" Her shrieks echoing across the submerged Whispering Pines development. Pure justice. The diesel fumes from excavators working all night, worth every gallon. Her fatal mistake? Assuming this old rancher knew nothing about federal water rights that predate her entire neighborhood by a century. Overnight, her luxury community became an isolated island. Me? The only ferryman. What would you do if they destroyed your family's legacy? Because this revenge story gets so much better. My name is Ezra Hartwell, and I'm the third generation of my family to work this land. What's left of it anyway? 40 acres. That's all that remains of the 2,000-acre cattle ranch my great-grandfather carved out of Montana wilderness in 1898. The rest? Sold off piece by piece over the decades to cover medical bills, drought losses, and the kind of financial bleeding that slowly kills family operations like ours. But we kept the heart of it, the original homestead, the winter pastures, and most importantly, the stone bridge my great-grandfather built with his own hands in 1924 to connect our grazing lands across Willow Creek. I can still smell the limestone mortar dust from his workshop, still feel the rough texture of those hand-carved stones under my fingertips. Every morning for 30 years, I'd driven cattle across that bridge, listening to the satisfying clip-clop of hooves on century-old stonework, the sound of home. That bridge wasn't just transportation. It was family DNA made visible in Montana stone, which is why when my wife Martha died 2 years ago, I'd sit on that bridge every evening, tracing the initials she'd carved there on our wedding day. EH plus MH, forever. The stone was warm from the sun, and for a few minutes, the $847,000 in medical bills didn't seem quite so crushing. Tuesday morning, 7 a.m., I'm feeding cattle when a white Tesla purrs down my gravel drive like a shark in shallow water. Out steps this blonde woman in a business suit that probably costs more than my monthly feed bill. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, the kind of person who probably has her coffee maker professionally detailed. "Mr. Hartwell? I'm Cordelia Blackwood, president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association." Her voice carried that particular brand of condescension, reserved for anyone who owns livestock. The crisp scent of her expensive perfume clashed with the honest smell of hay and manure. "I need to discuss your bridge situation." Bridge situation. Like my family's century-old legacy was a plumbing leak. She pulled out a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "I'm afraid there's been a surveying error discovered during our recent development expansion. Your bridge actually sits within our HOA boundaries." I set down my feed bucket, metal clanging against the fence post. "Ma'am, that bridge was built 23 years before your development was even a twinkle in some city planner's eye. I understand the sentimental value," she said with a smile colder than January wind. "But community standards must be maintained. The rustic aesthetic simply doesn't align with our property values." Rustic aesthetic. She was talking about my great-grandfather's craftsmanship like it was a rusted-out pickup on blocks. That's when she handed me the violation notice. 30 days to demolish. 47 signatures from HOA residents demanding immediate resolution of the eyesore issue. A list of contractors pre-approved for demolition services. The cherry on top? A business card for her husband's construction company, offering to handle the job at a family-friendly discount. Because nothing says family-friendly like charging you to destroy your own heritage. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, keeping my voice level, "that bridge connects my winter pastures to my main ranch. Without it, I'd need to build 3 miles of new fencing and an alternate route that would cost $50,000. Money I definitely didn't have. Not with Martha's medical debt crushing me like a slow avalanche. She clicked her pen with the precision of a guillotine blade. Perhaps it's time to consider whether cattle ranching is still viable in our evolving community. There it was, the real message. "You don't belong here anymore, old man." I watched her Tesla disappear down my driveway, kicking up dust that settled on everything like a bad omen. The violation notice felt heavy in my calloused hands, but Cordelia Blackwood had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another broken-down rancher too tired to fight back. She was about to learn that the Hartwell family doesn't break that easy. 2 days after Cordelia's visit, a process server showed up at my door with enough legal paperwork to start a bonfire. The smell of expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the stench of intimidation tactics. The law firm's letterhead read, Pemberton, Hayes and Associates, one of those downtown outfits with marble lobbies and hourly rates that could fund a small country. The threat was crystal clear. Remove the bridge voluntarily or face a lawsuit that would cost me more than my entire ranch was worth. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner. Sometimes it forces you to remember skills you thought you'd forgotten. 28 years ago, before I inherited this ranch, I'd spent 4 years as a paralegal in the county courthouse. Back then, I'd learned that most property disputes aren't won in courtrooms. They're won in dusty basement archives where the real history lives. So, I drove my rusted F-150 down to the courthouse, breathing in that familiar cocktail of old paper and bureaucratic defeat, and started digging through land records that hadn't seen daylight since disco was popular. What I found in those yellowed files made my morning coffee taste a whole lot better. The original 1898 federal land grant clearly showed Willow Creek and a 30-foot easement on both sides as perpetual public access for agricultural and transportation purposes. My great-grandfather hadn't just built a bridge. He'd built it on federally protected land that couldn't legally be claimed by any private development. Something about grandfathered easements and federal water navigation rights that most modern lawyers forget to check. Even better, the environmental impact study for Whispering Pines had somehow managed to completely ignore the existence of my bridge. You know what happens when developers file federal paperwork that omits century-old infrastructure. The whole project becomes what lawyers call potentially voidable. Fancy words for, oops, you might have to tear down everything and start over. I photocopied everything twice, then called my old Marine buddy Tucker, who'd traded his sergeant stripes for a law degree and now specialized in water rights disputes. The conversation was enlightening. Ezra, hypothetically speaking, if someone built a development that blocked federal creek access, what would happen? Hypothetically, the feds could declare the whole thing illegal and force complete reconstruction. Plus fines. Lots of fines. Why? Oh, no reason. Just curious about hypothetical situations involving bridges and water rights. Meanwhile, Cordelia was busy playing her own games. She'd convinced the county to send an inspector who miraculously discovered serious structural concerns with my bridge. Cracks in the foundation, potential for catastrophic failure, immediate public safety hazard. The same inspector who'd somehow missed these serious concerns during 5 years of routine county inspections. I knew exactly where those cracks came from, because my security cameras had caught 3 men with sledgehammers having a very productive 2 a.m. work session on my bridge. Men driving a truck registered to Blackwood Construction, LLC. Nothing says structural integrity concerns like a little midnight demolition prep work. When I confronted Cordelia about this nocturnal maintenance visit, she just smiled that refrigerator-cold smile. Mr. Hartwell, I hope you're not suggesting that county officials would falsify safety reports. That sounds almost libelous. The woman was good, I'll give her that, but she'd just made her first real mistake. Here's something most people don't know about insurance fraud. Deliberately damaging someone else's property to justify your own actions isn't just unethical, it's a Class C felony, carrying up to 5 years and $100,000 in fines. Thanks to modern security technology, I had about 40 minutes of high-definition video proving premeditated destruction of private property. The insurance company was very interested in these materials. So was the county attorney's office. So was the State Environmental Protection Agency, once they understood that someone was manufacturing safety concerns to bypass federal water access laws. But Cordelia wasn't done escalating. 3 days later, my insurance company called about complaints that my cattle were aggressively threatening visitors. Same day, the health department arrived to investigate unsanitary conditions around my livestock operations. The inspector, a kid who clearly knew cattle about as well as I knew quantum physics, spent 2 hours photographing perfectly normal barnyard smells and muttering about public health violations. That evening, I found fresh survey stakes driven into my winter pasture, each marked future road development. The county planning office confirmed someone had filed preliminary applications to run a service road straight through my grazing land. Guess whose signature was on every application? The message was clear: withdraw your bridge opposition, or we'll bury you in legal battles until your great-grandchildren are still paying court fees. I sat on my porch that night, listening to creek water flow under century-old stones, and realized Cordelia Blackwood had just declared war on the wrong family. She wanted legal hardball? Fine. But she'd forgotten something crucial about small-town courthouse records. Sometimes they contain federal treaties that even fancy city lawyers don't know exist. Friday morning, I woke up to the rumble of diesel engines that made my coffee cup vibrate on the kitchen table. Through my window, I watched a convoy that looked like it was planning to invade a small country. 2 yellow excavators, a demolition truck, and enough equipment to level half of downtown. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes mixed with morning dew as Cordelia climbed out of her Tesla, wearing what I can only describe as a victory outfit. Crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile you see on sharks right before feeding time. "Mr. Hartwell," she called out, waving an official-looking document. "I have wonderful news. The county has issued an emergency demolition order for your bridge. Structural failure imminent. Public safety requires immediate action." Emergency order. Issued at 6 a.m. on a Friday morning. You know what I learned during my paralegal days? Real emergencies don't wait for convenient timing, but manufactured emergencies always happen when lawyers' offices are closed and appeals courts aren't in session. Basic intimidation tactic from the municipal harassment playbook. The demolition was scheduled for Monday morning. That gave me exactly 72 hours to remove any personal belongings from the bridge area. How thoughtful of them. I spent Friday afternoon at the courthouse filing an emergency injunction request, but it hit a brick wall faster than a cow in a tornado. The judge, who I later discovered was a regular golf partner with Cordelia's husband, denied my temporary restraining order without even reading the federal easement documents. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said, barely looking up from his papers, "county safety inspections take precedence over property disputes. The bridge comes down Monday." That's when I realized this whole operation was choreographed tighter than a high school marching band. Saturday morning brought a discovery that made my blood pressure spike. I was checking my cattle when I noticed fresh concrete cracks in my bridge foundation that definitely hadn't been there Friday. But these weren't the crude sledgehammer marks from last week. These were precision cuts, made by someone who understood exactly where to weaken load-bearing structures. My security cameras told the whole story. 3 men with concrete saws and hydraulic jacks, working by headlamp light from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. The whine of diamond-tipped blades cutting through century-old limestone. Same truck, same company logo, same federal crime being committed in high-definition detail. They'd actually sabotaged my bridge to justify destroying it. I called Tucker immediately. They're not just lying about structural problems, they're manufacturing them. Jesus, Ezra. That's criminal conspiracy, destruction of private property, plus obstruction of federal waterway access. I could hear him flipping through law books. We're talking serious prison time if you can prove premeditation. I can prove premeditation. Question is, can I prove it before Monday morning? Sunday evening, I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt absolutely necessary. I loaded my old deer rifle and spent the night sitting on my bridge, listening to creek water flow over stones my great-grandfather had placed with his own hands. Around midnight, the demolition crew showed up to stage their equipment. When they saw me sitting there with a shotgun across my lap, they decided to park at the property line and wait for daylight. Smart choice. Sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later. Young guy named Martinez, who I'd known since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. "Ezra, you can't be out here armed. You know that, right?" "Deputy Martinez, I'm on my own property with a legally owned firearm, committing no crimes and threatening nobody. Last I checked, that was still constitutional in Montana." He radioed back to dispatch, then walked over. "Look, I understand you're upset about the bridge situation. What would really help is arresting the people who've been vandalizing my property all week. I handed him a USB drive. 40 hours of security footage, everything time-stamped and documented. Martinez looked at the drive, then at the demolition equipment, then back at me. Something in his expression told me he was starting to smell the same rat I'd been tracking. Monday morning arrived like a funeral procession. 2 sheriff's deputies, the demolition crew, county inspector with a clipboard, and Cordelia Blackwood, standing off to the side like she was watching her favorite soap opera. That's when my real insurance policy revealed itself. See, while Cordelia had been busy orchestrating this legal theater, I'd been doing some choreography of my own. Every HOA board meeting for the past month, every private conversation between her and the county inspector, every phone call to her husband's construction company, all recorded on the wireless microphones I'd been strategically placing around her favorite meeting spots, including last night's call, where she'd explicitly discussed creating additional structural damage to justify emergency demolition before federal agencies could interfere. Sometimes the best defense is letting your enemies hang themselves with their own words. The morning after they demolished my bridge, I woke up to silence. No clip-clop of cattle hooves on century-old stone, just the hollow sound of creek water flowing where my family's legacy used to stand, mixed with the distant hum of Cordelia's victory celebration echoing across the valley. But Cordelia Blackwood wasn't content with just winning. She wanted total annihilation. Tuesday brought the first salvo of her scorched earth campaign. An anonymous health department complaint about noxious livestock odors, creating a public nuisance. The inspector, a pale city kid who probably thought milk came from cartons, spent 3 hours photographing my perfectly normal cattle operation, while breathing through his mouth like he was touring a plague ward. Wednesday morning, property tax assessors materialized unannounced to reevaluate recent improvements. 15 years of stable assessments, but suddenly my ranch needed urgent review the day after losing federal appeals. Coincidence, I'm sure. Thursday brought noise violation complaints about my 6 a.m. cattle feeding schedule, because apparently the sound of hay hitting feed troughs was disturbing the suburban serenity that Cordelia had worked so hard to curate. Next, they'd probably complain about roosters crowing at dawn. But Friday's attack hit where it hurt most. I was driving my feed truck down the shared access road, the same route I'd used for 30 years, when I found orange traffic cones blocking my path like a line of plastic soldiers. A fresh sign reading, "Private Road, No Through Traffic," had sprouted overnight. Cordelia stood beside her pristine Tesla, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile that could freeze Satan's coffee. "Mr. Hartwell, perfect timing. The HOA voted last night to restrict access on our private roadway. Insurance liability concerns, you understand. This road was built on a county easement in 1962, I said, tasting the metallic tang of barely controlled rage. You can't privatize public access. Actually, we can. Our legal team discovered the original easement only covered residential traffic. Commercial livestock operations require separate permits," her smile widened, "which were never obtained. That's when I realized how deep this went. Someone had spent serious money digging through 40-year-old county records, hunting for legal loopholes like a truffle pig searching for buried treasure. The kind of systematic research that takes teams of lawyers and costs more than most people's annual income. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was a coordinated campaign to force me off land that had been in my family for 4 generations. Over the next week, the attacks came with military precision. Insurance complaints about unsafe livestock practices, environmental reports about cattle waste contaminating groundwater, fire department notifications about improperly stored agricultural chemicals, which turned out to be standard cattle feed stored exactly like it had been for 3 decades. Each complaint triggered inspections. Each inspection required paperwork. Each form demanded fees and legal responses that steadily drained my already